Hey, everybody. Amazon brand owners, Amazon sellers, Chris McCabe here at eCommerce Chris. I wanted to comment in a post peak sales period like Prime Day on a couple of complaints we heard from sellers about how that period went, but also just how their dealings with Amazon internal teams are going, what's costing them sales, what's causing them frustration, and what they're trying to do about it. I'll lay out a few things initially, such as reporting abuse, listing violations, and other types of abuse. Most recently, in the Prime Day period, we saw a lot of deals abuse, deals that shouldn't have even existed that buyers had access to, but not just deals abuse during a peak sales period. Listing abuse in general has really gotten out of hand. Several people have hired us to report their competitors. We've more or less become the leaders in that sort of consulting and that kind of work. And we still do it, of course, successfully, but yes, it's gotten harder. And the reason is that Amazon has begun looking the other way when confronted with certain kinds of violations and abuses. They've been doing that a lot more, I would say, throughout 2024, but particularly the last few months since the springtime. And of course, we're working with brand owners, we're working with Amazon internal teams trying to figure out why. There will be other videos, other long-winded explanations once I have them in more detail in terms of the why. But the most important thing to know right now is that this is happening. It's happening frequently. Many people at Amazon are aware that legitimate abuse reports are being ignored. And we're beginning to see more clearly the formation of two Amazons, two marketplaces. And there are haves and there are have-nots. There are some sellers that are allowed to get away with things. And if they're reported either by internal teams at Amazon or reported by their competitors, or even in some cases reported by buyers, especially in the case of reviews abuse and reviews that obviously don't make sense, they'll get reported and members of teams at Amazon will simply look away from it and they won't take action on it. Sometimes they'll even take a legitimate abuse report and respond to it saying, we've reviewed this. We acknowledge that you sent us this information. We did not see cause for action. We did not see reasons to warn or act against this seller. And of course, most of those instances, any reasonably intelligent middle schooler or high schooler could look at it and within seconds understand that it's a violation of Amazon's policies, which leads us to different outcomes. Of course, either they sent the message saying they had reviewed it when nothing of the sort happened. They just ignored it and threw it away, which is becoming alarmingly clear in a lot of instances that we follow up on with escalations. Or they reviewed it. They did understand what was going on and they decided for whatever reason not to take action on it because they didn't want to punish that seller, or because they anticipated perhaps that if they did punish that seller, especially if they had to suspend that whole account, that there might be somebody else they had to explain themselves to, like an account manager, or maybe they looked in the account annotations, for example, for reviews abuse, past enforcement, or for, let's say, misuse of variations policies, listings created erroneously, probably deliberately by that seller. The enforcement teams may have looked at that case and said, well, we've enforced them before. They continue to violate these policies. We would really have to suspend the entire account, and we probably wouldn't be able to accept any appeals for this. So I think that's one of the causes, right? People at Amazon know that if they did take the proper action, they would be looking at a lifetime ban or a block of that seller account. It could be a seller doing 20, 30, 40 million a year. And they don't want to be responsible for that type of action, or they think there might be blowback against them, or maybe they even just assume that that seller is connected enough to get reinstated anyway. And so they're reluctant to take the proper action. The problem is, of course, whoever is reporting legitimate abuse will continue to do so. The only issue at that point will be, do they know how to report abuse? Are they continually opening up seller support cases or emailing executive seller relations, or maybe they're just unsure what to do and they have an account manager they pay for every month and they tell that person. Which brings me not to more explanation of what's going on, but what to do about it. This will be the part 2 of what I wanted to talk about today. Well, what to do about it if you have an account manager is certainly to bring it to their attention and certainly to make sure they have an internal escalation going as soon as possible. I understand that, again, alarmingly, what we're seeing in many cases is that account managers come back with, well, they told me they'd look into it. They can't tell me what's going on. They can't tell me what to tell you. All I can tell you is that I'm not responsible for that decision. Well, we already knew that. So that's not really useful information. Typically brand owners go back and say, listen, we're paying you $5,000 a month. We need a better answer. We need another escalation, or we need something to happen. And then they might get another answer that says something like, well, it's been reviewed and the appropriate messaging has been sent to that seller. And of course, we or they or anyone looking live on the site can see that really nothing concrete happened. So if somebody's wrist was slapped, it was slapped so lightly that maybe the seller even knew that there would be no consequences if they went back and did the same thing again. Sometimes we see the ASINs down for a day or two. It's extremely perfunctory. It's just a show. It's a smoke screen to make it look like the seller's been punished. In a lot of cases, they don't even have the ASIN down. Maybe they just receive an innocuous warning and there's really no consequences, right? Amazon's more or less communicating them to them silently or otherwise. We're going to make it look like we're punishing you, but there's no real punishment here. You can go back to whatever you were doing. Unfortunately, the outcome isn't good for buyer experience. It's not good for sellers who are trying to follow policies or who are following policies within their category. It makes their paid account manager look bad. It makes a lot of us in the Amazon seller community that are trying to help people report abuse look bad too. And it just kicks the can down the road. It doesn't really solve anything, which brings me to another issue in terms of strategy. A lot of Amazon teams are built not to communicate useful information with each other. We already know that they're not built to reply usefully to messages from sellers. Everyone knows how terrible Amazon's communication is with sellers on the outward side, outbound communication. So what do you do about that? Well, you can start with your account manager. Let's say you don't have an account manager. Definitely try to identify whether it's going to Amazon conferences, and I mean conferences that Amazon's doing or people who have established relations with Amazon are doing. Whether it's conferences or going on LinkedIn, establish who is who in your category, who's managing your category, who's responsible for your category. You may not be able to figure out who's responsible for compliance or for policy enforcement. Some of those people are on LinkedIn. Some of them aren't. Some of them are mid-level management, senior level and above. Some of them aren't. It really depends. But the bottom line is identify these players and try to reach out to them and say, I went through your established protocols. I didn't get anywhere. And these violations are continuing to harm seller experience, buyer experience, and also harming Amazon itself, right? Ultimately, a lot of brand owners who have been around for a while, who are established, know how to contact parties in Amazon legal or parties in the senior executive ranks, and they will show this information. And of course, the only way to get executives to move these days is to show all of the repetitive past failures by their underlings or by the protocol level people that you're supposed to go to and how they either deliberately or not failed to take action, right? So you have to make that case. The burden is on you. It's not going to be decided by mid-level management or senior level managers having conferences where they discuss this amongst themselves internally. That doesn't seem to have any kind of quality assurance or audit path or audit trail. So unfortunately right now, and I would say for the rest of this year, it's going to be up to you to present the information to them in a cogent and coherent and reliable manner. So what does that mean? Again, in terms of proactive solutions for you, it means have your best written communicators on this and make sure you keep it to a page or two and make sure you're not relying just on seller support cases or in the occasional phone call with somebody in biz dev, business development, or even with your category manager or an account manager. Because ultimately, if they are not the decision makers, the key people that have action worthy control or power over what happens and what the outcomes are, they're going to shrug and they're going to throw up their hands at some point. And this isn't to throw them under the bus, because there are a lot of educated, well-intentioned people at Amazon that I speak to and my team speak to all the time who are just as frustrated as you are as a seller. And they want these solutions too. And they're banging their heads against a wall too. It's unfortunately the dysfunctional bureaucracy that's been set up and put together by people inside Amazon, different teams. They're not necessarily just in marketplace management or in TRMS, transaction risk management services, which is the part of the company I used to work for. They could even be in other parts of the company, but so far they've gotten to the point where they haven't been motivated enough to change things, to improve their communication with sellers, of course, but also just to within their own systems, whether it's tools, whether it's training, whether it's SOPs, to stop the flow of misinformation from coming out when sellers appeal things or when they report abuse. Coming out of a peak sales period like Prime Day, we see everything under the sun. We see Amazon teams push false information just out of ignorance, sometimes repeating bad info that they receive when they're asking around internally. Again, sometimes it's not necessarily their fault that they've been given bad information, but in a sense, it is their fault or it is their mistake for spreading misinformation. And that is what makes this work 10 times harder. Is it impossible to report abuse? No, of course not. We wouldn't be doing it on a daily basis if this were impossible to conduct successfully. It is harder, and it is harder than 12 months ago. And there, again, are many reasons for this. There's internal intransigence. There's infrastructure needs. A lot of resources and money and hiring is not dedicated in this part of the company. It's dedicated towards growing Amazon, beating quarterly estimates of revenue and making sure that this Q4 is better than last Q4, or this Prime Day is better than last Prime Day. They're on the clock for this stuff. They're continually measured under these types of numbers. And believe me, they're conscious of it at the top levels of the company. So it means that you've got to have a strategy that's built for the long haul, but also for making sure if your competitors are getting away with something, you don't just report abuse and say, look, they're getting away with it. Why can't we do it too? That falls on deaf ears, of course. Make sure that if they have a competitive advantage, you're reporting it and figuring out why they've got that competitive advantage. Naturally, Amazon might come back and say, oh, thanks for alerting us to their abuses. Now we'll make sure that we level the playing field by stopping them from the listing abuse or variations abuse or reviews abuse or deals abuse. There's so many kinds of abuse now. Believe me, Amazon knows that it's multiplying. If they put out a statement saying that they're on top of it, which they like to do on the blog or on LinkedIn posts, if they try to act like they're reducing the amounts of abuse or the number of people committing these kinds of abuses, they're aware that that's not the case. They have to say these things for PR purposes and, for media consumption purposes. But believe me, there are enough highly placed, knowing people inside Amazon that know that they're losing that battle, because we see it on the outside. We see listings that should not be up, right? On a continual basis. We see people report things 15, 17, 18 times before Amazon takes action on it. They know that their lower level teams are not doing their jobs and that are failing them. And unfortunately, right now, that means for you, whether it's heading into a, Q4 in a few months, actually in 2 months, or looking backwards at how Prime Day went or how the rest of this year has gone, your competitors may understand this material and they may strategize it better than you do. So you have to have it buttoned up and you have to have a strategy going forward that accounts for the escalations you might have to do. Escalation does not mean you write one thing and you spam it all over the company. That never works. That doesn't work now. It probably will never work in any way, shape, or form. It means that when you're consuming content online, you're not just kind of assuming that it's gold, assuming that it's legitimate, copying and pasting that sort of strategy just because somebody's going for clicks or, trying to get you to pay more attention to them. Have a strategy that makes sense within your category. Have a strategy that makes sense within escalations you've probably pursued in the past that were successful, and have a strategy that coincides nicely with who makes what kinds of decisions inside the company and what motivates them to take the right decision path versus the path that ignores whatever you're trying to put in front of them. That might mean you have to rewrite some things that you've submitted. It might mean that you might have to understand which team does what, which escalation paths are hot right now versus cold. Sometimes that changes week to week, month to month. So you're going to have to stay on top of that, and you're going to have to stay educated on it without just punching your ticket for a certain conference every few months or maybe even once a year and assuming that you can just make the rounds, go around to different booths and get all the right answers. That's not really how this works, right? You have to have a strategy that encompasses all facets of communication, both with internal teams at Amazon, with your agency owners, if you have an agency, if you've got attorneys that you're working with, presumably intellectual property trained attorneys, if you've got IP related issues. That seems to be one of the bigger problems right now. You have a strategy with them. And of course, if you have suspensions, whether it's ASIN or account level, you have a strategy with your appeals submissions, or if you're hiring out appeals consultants. So I'm happy to discuss any of the material in this video. I could go on and on about it. Typically, we try to keep our educational content between 10 and 15 minutes. Happy to answer any questions at eCommerce Chris, or if you want to email me directly at Chris, CHRIS, at ecommercechris.com. Thanks again for listening, and hopefully you're experiencing the best sales you've ever had. Thank you.